When Ryan called to say he and Melissa needed a place to stay for a while, I didn't hesitate. He's my only son, and when your child needs help, you open your door. They had been struggling financially after Ryan lost his job, and their apartment lease was ending. I told them they could stay with me until they got back on their feet. I even fixed up the guest room, bought new sheets, and stocked the fridge with their favorite things. I was happy to have family around again. At first, things seemed fine. Melissa thanked me every day, and Ryan helped with a few chores. I thought, maybe this will bring us closer. But after a few weeks, I started to notice small changes. Melissa began acting like the house was hers. She'd move my things around, change my TV channels, and even rearrange my kitchen cabinets without asking. When I mentioned it, she'd smile and say, "Just trying to make things easier for you, Mom." That word, Mom, started to sound more like mockery than affection. One afternoon, I came home from the grocery store to find Melissa lounging on my couch, scrolling through her phone, while Ryan was out looking for work. She looked at me and said, "You really shouldn't be carrying all those bags, Evelyn. At your age, you could hurt your back." I brushed it off and put the groceries away. But something in her tone rubbed me the wrong way. I've always been independent. I still drive myself everywhere, do my own gardening, and host Sunday dinners for the family. I don't see myself as fragile just because I'm getting older. But Melissa seemed determined to make me feel like I was one step away from a nursing home. She'd sigh loudly if I asked for help, make comments about how I should take it easy, and even tried to tell Ryan that I shouldn't be managing my own finances anymore. Ryan, bless his heart, didn't see it. He kept saying, "Mom, Melissa's just trying to help." But I knew better. I could see the way she rolled her eyes when he wasn't looking. I could feel the tension building in my own home. Still, I stayed quiet, hoping she'd realize her behavior was disrespectful. Then came that Sunday dinner. It's a tradition I've kept since Ryan was little, a home-cooked meal where we all sit together and talk. I roasted a chicken, mashed some potatoes, and baked cornbread. It was simple, warm, and filled with love. When I reached for a second serving, Melissa's voice cut through the air. "Mom, at your age, you don't need a full plate." The room went silent. Ryan chuckled awkwardly, probably thinking she was joking. My granddaughter looked down at her food. My face burned, but I didn't say a word. I just smiled, placed my fork down, and took a slow sip of water. Inside, though, something shifted. That moment told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't a guest in my own house anymore. I was being treated like a burden. And right then, I decided that something had to change. After that dinner, things began to change quickly. Melissa stopped pretending to be polite. The sweetness she had in the beginning disappeared, and the real her started to show. She no longer said thank you when I made meals or helped around the house. Instead, she acted like I was in her way. She began taking over small things at first, like deciding what should be cooked or when laundry should be done. One morning, I found her standing by the washing machine, pulling out my freshly folded towels. She shook her head and said, "You really don't fold them right, Evelyn. Let me handle it." I stood there quietly, feeling like a guest in my own laundry room. Soon, she started managing things that were never hers to control. She took over the mail, sorted through it, and even tried to organize my bills. I remember once walking into the kitchen to find her sitting with my checkbook open. When I asked what she was doing, she smiled and said, "Just checking if you've paid the utilities. Ryan and I don't want anything to fall behind." I felt my chest tighten. The house, the bills, everything, it was all under my name. But she made it sound like I couldn't handle simple responsibilities anymore. I didn't argue that day. I just picked up my checkbook and put it in my room. But from that moment, I knew things were slipping out of my control. The way she talked to Ryan also began to change. When I was around, she would lower her voice, but I could still hear pieces of what she said, comments like, "Your mom's losing track of things," or "She's not keeping up like she used to." I tried to ignore it, but each word dug a little deeper. Ryan didn't see what I saw. He was grateful for any calm moment between us, and didn't want to believe there was a problem. When I mentioned Melissa's attitude, he'd say, "Mom, she's just adjusting. She doesn't mean anything by it." But I knew Melissa meant every word. Her eyes told the truth, cold, calculating, and full of judgment. The house started to feel different too. The laughter and warmth that once filled it slowly faded. I'd walk into the kitchen and they'd go quiet. Sometimes I'd hear whispers stop the moment I entered the room. I began spending more time in my bedroom just to avoid the tension. Melissa's control grew stronger every week. She began redecorating without asking, replacing my curtains, moving my furniture, and saying things like, "It looks more modern this way." It was as if she was erasing every trace of me from my own home. But I kept my silence. I didn't want to cause a fight or push Ryan away. I told myself it would get better once they found their own place. But deep down, I already knew it wasn't going to get better. Melissa wasn't planning to leave anytime soon. That Sunday, I woke up early like I always did for family dinners. Cooking has always brought me peace, and I wanted to keep the tradition alive even though things had been tense lately. I seasoned the chicken just the way Ryan liked it, mashed the potatoes until they were creamy, and baked the cornbread golden brown. I set the table neatly, using the good plates I saved for family gatherings. I wanted the evening to feel normal, even if it didn't start that way. When everyone sat down, I tried to make light conversation. I asked Ella about school and listened as Ryan talked about a few job interviews he'd lined up. For a moment, I almost forgot how uncomfortable the house had felt lately. But then I saw Melissa watching me closely, with that look she always gave when she was about to say something cutting. As I reached for the serving bowl to get a bit more mashed potatoes, she suddenly spoke, her voice sharp and loud enough to make everyone stop eating. "Mom," she said with a fake laugh, "at your age, you don't need a full plate. You should be watching your portions." The room went quiet. The sound of the clock ticking filled the space. My hand froze halfway between the serving spoon and my plate. I could feel all eyes on me, Ryan's uncomfortable smile, Ella's lowered gaze. Even the family dog looked uneasy, as if sensing the shift in the air. For a second, I thought maybe I'd misheard her. But then I saw the small smirk on her face. She wasn't joking. She meant it. My heart pounded in my chest. I've been through a lot in my 68 years, but no one had ever made me feel so small in my own home. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, and my throat tightened, but I forced a calm smile. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing me hurt. I set the spoon down gently and said, "You're right, dear. Maybe just a little less for me tonight." Ryan tried to lighten the mood with a small laugh, but it only made things worse. He didn't understand that it wasn't about food. It was about respect. Ella stayed silent, poking her fork into her cornbread, her eyes fixed on her plate. Dinner continued awkwardly after that. Melissa chatted cheerfully about some new furniture she wanted for the house, as if it were hers. I listened quietly, my stomach twisting tighter with every word. Each laugh she gave felt like another reminder that she didn't see me as family anymore. She saw me as someone in her way. When the meal ended, I stood up, cleared the dishes, and told everyone I was tired. I went to my room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. For the first time in a long while, I felt like a stranger in my own home. I didn't cry that night. I just sat there thinking. Melissa had crossed a line, and I knew there would be no going back. I might have stayed quiet at the table, but in my mind, something had shifted. I promised myself that night she would never make me feel that small again. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, hearing Melissa's voice over and over in my head. "At your age, you don't need a full plate." It wasn't about food. It was about the way she saw me. Like I was old, weak, and no longer deserving of respect. I thought about all the ways I had made their lives comfortable since they moved in. The more I thought, the angrier I became. Every bill in this house had my name on it. I was paying for the roof over their heads, the food they ate, and the power that kept their lights on. Melissa hadn't paid a cent since the day she arrived. She treated my home like her personal space, yet contributed nothing but complaints. I realized I had allowed her to get too comfortable. So I decided it was time to remind her whose house this really was. But I wouldn't raise my voice or argue. I would do it quietly, in my own way. The next morning, I canceled the weekly grocery delivery. For years, I'd kept that service because it was easier for me. But now, I wanted them to notice what life felt like without me making it easy. By the end of the week, the fridge was half empty. Melissa opened the door and frowned. "Didn't you say groceries were coming today?" she asked. I smiled and said, "I decided to stop the deliveries. We all need to tighten our belts a little." She didn't like that answer one bit. Then I went online and canceled the streaming subscriptions that I had been paying for. I didn't say a word about it. That evening, I sat in my chair knitting while Melissa and Ryan tried to watch a movie. The screen popped up with a message. Payment required to continue service. Melissa groaned and called out, "Evelyn, something's wrong with the TV." I kept my eyes on my knitting and said calmly, "Oh, I canceled that." It was time to cut back on unnecessary expenses. Her silence afterward was loud enough to fill the room. A few days later, I stopped stocking their favorite snacks and stopped cooking big meals every night. I'd make small portions just for myself. When Melissa came into the kitchen looking for food, I'd simply say, "There's bread and eggs if you're hungry." I knew she hated cooking. I could see her frustration building, but she kept forcing polite smiles around Ryan. Inside, I felt a quiet satisfaction. I wasn't being cruel. I was simply stepping back and letting her live the independent life she acted like she wanted. By the end of that week, Melissa's attitude started to crack. She began making small comments about how things seemed different. I just nodded and went on with my day. I didn't need to argue anymore. My silence spoke for me. For the first time in months, I felt in control again. The house felt like mine once more, and Melissa finally started realizing that her comfort came from me. And that comfort was no longer guaranteed. It didn't take long for Melissa to finally lose her temper. One afternoon, I was sitting in the living room reading my newspaper when I heard her heavy footsteps coming down the hallway. She barged in, her face red with anger. "Evelyn, what is going on in this house?" she snapped. "The Wi-Fi's gone, the fridge is empty, and there's no grocery delivery this week. You can't just stop paying for things." I folded the paper slowly and looked up at her. My voice was calm when I said, "I can do whatever I want in my home." Her mouth fell open. She wasn't expecting that answer. For weeks, she'd been speaking to me like she owned the place, but this was the first time I'd pushed back. She stood there glaring, her hands on her hips, waiting for me to back down. But I didn't. I just looked at her and waited to see what she'd say next. She crossed her arms and raised her voice. "You're being selfish, Evelyn. You're living in this big house, and Ryan is your only child. One day this house will be his anyway. Why are you acting like you can't share?" Her words hit me like a slap. Not only was she ungrateful, but now she was talking about my home like it was already theirs. I took a deep breath and said, "This house is mine. I worked for it, I paid for it, and I've maintained it my whole life. No one has the right to take that from me." But Melissa wasn't done. She laughed, a sharp, bitter laugh that made my stomach twist. "Oh, come on," she said. "You're getting older, Evelyn. You can't handle everything forever. Maybe it's time Ryan started taking over. It would make things easier for everyone." I could feel my hands shaking, not from fear, but from pure anger. The nerve of her, standing in my living room, under my roof, acting like she was entitled to everything I'd built. I kept my composure, but inside I was boiling. I had given them kindness, shelter, food, and comfort. And this was how she repaid me, by calling me useless. Ryan came in a few minutes later, confused by the noise. "What's going on?" he asked, looking between us. Melissa turned to him and said, "Your mother's losing it. She's cutting us off from everything. She thinks she can control us because we live here." Ryan looked uncomfortable, caught in the middle. "Mom, maybe you could have talked to us first," he said softly. His words stung, but I didn't blame him. He didn't see the manipulation behind her smile. He still thought Melissa was being reasonable. I stood up slowly, looked at both of them, and said, "If you want Wi-Fi, groceries, or anything else, you're free to pay for it yourselves." Then I walked past them and went into my room. Behind me, I heard Melissa mutter something under her breath. Something about how she couldn't wait until I wasn't around anymore. That was the final straw. I closed my door and sat on my bed, shaking with anger, but determined to stay calm. I knew now that this wasn't just disrespect. It was greed. And that meant it was time to stop hoping things would fix themselves. I wasn't going to argue anymore. I was going to take action. After that argument, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Melissa's boldness, her confidence, it didn't come from nowhere. She acted like she had control over things that weren't hers. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I went into my study and pulled out the small box where I kept my financial papers. I hadn't checked them closely in a while, trusting that everything was as it should be. But as I looked through my recent statements, my heart started to race. There were charges I didn't recognize, expensive ones. Designer clothes, online orders, and delivery services I'd never used. The total was far from small. At first, I thought maybe there'd been a mistake or some kind of fraud. But then I looked at the shipping addresses and recognized my own home address. That's when it hit me. Melissa had been using my credit card. I sat there staring at the receipts, my hands trembling. She must have taken my card from the kitchen drawer, used it for her shopping, and then put it back before I noticed. I felt sick to my stomach. After everything I'd done for her, opening my home, feeding her, and treating her like family. She was stealing from me. The next morning, I decided to make sure. I went online and checked every statement from the past few months. The more I looked, the more evidence I found. Purchases for handbags, makeup, expensive candles, even a few online subscriptions. It was clear this wasn't an accident. She'd been doing it for months, counting on me not to notice. I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I quietly printed every transaction and organized them in a folder. I wanted proof, solid proof that couldn't be twisted or denied. When I was done, I called my lawyer, Mr. Whitman, a kind man who'd handled my affairs for years. When I told him everything, he listened patiently. When I finished, there was a moment of silence before he said, "Mrs. Parker, you've been far too generous. And yes, you can absolutely do something about this." I asked what my options were. Could I make her pay me back? Could I legally remove them from my house? He said, "You own the property. You've allowed them to stay out of kindness. But if they've crossed a line, and clearly they have, you have every right to ask them to leave. If they refuse, we'll serve an eviction notice." Hearing those words brought a calm over me I hadn't felt in months. I wasn't powerless. I had the law on my side. Mr. Whitman even offered to help me prepare the papers so everything would be done properly. After our call, I sat there staring at the stack of printed receipts. Each one was a reminder of her betrayal. But strangely, I didn't feel sad anymore. I felt focused. Melissa thought I was old and weak, someone she could take advantage of. She was about to learn that I wasn't as helpless as she believed. That night, as I filed the papers neatly into a folder, I knew exactly what I had to do next. I wasn't just going to take back my peace. I was going to take back my home. I waited a few days before putting my plan into action. I wanted to be calm, collected, and fully prepared. The folder with the printed receipts and legal papers sat neatly on my desk, and every time I looked at it, it reminded me that I was doing the right thing. This wasn't about revenge, it was about respect. I had opened my home out of love, and they had turned that kindness into an opportunity to take advantage of me. That Sunday, I decided to do it. I cooked a simple dinner, nothing fancy, just enough to make the evening feel normal. The air in the dining room felt heavy, though. Melissa chatted like nothing was wrong, bragging about a new outfit she'd ordered online. I kept my face neutral and let her talk. Ryan was tired from work and didn't notice how forced her smile was. I waited until we were all seated before I spoke. "Ryan," I began quietly, setting down my fork, "I need to talk to you both about something important." Melissa glanced up, still smiling. "Of course, Evelyn. What's going on?" I looked at her straight in the eye. "You have 30 days to move out. I've already spoken to my attorney." The room went still. Ryan's fork slipped from his hand and hit the plate with a sharp clatter. Melissa's smile disappeared instantly. Her face went pale, and for a few seconds she didn't say a word. Then she forced a nervous laugh. "You're joking, right? You can't be serious." "I'm very serious," I said calmly. "This arrangement has gone on long enough. You both need to find your own place." Ryan looked shocked. "Mom, what happened? Why now?" I turned to him gently. "Ryan, I've given you both more time than I promised. I've been patient, but this is no longer working. I need my home back." Melissa quickly jumped in, her voice suddenly soft and sweet. "Evelyn, please don't take this the wrong way. I never meant to disrespect you. Things have just been stressful, that's all. We're family, we should stick together." Her tone was full of fake kindness, but I'd seen it before. This was her way of trying to smooth things over when she realized she'd gone too far. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I reached for the folder beside me, opened it, and slid a piece of paper across the table toward her. It was the eviction notice. Melissa stared at it for a moment, then looked up at me, her eyes wide. "You can't do this," she whispered. "I already have," I said quietly. "You both have 30 days. My lawyer will handle everything else." Ryan rubbed his forehead, clearly torn between us. "Mom, maybe we can talk about this." I cut him off gently but firmly. "There's nothing to talk about, honey. This decision is final." Melissa pushed her chair back and stood up, glaring at me. "You'll regret this, Evelyn," she hissed. "You think you're being strong, but you're just bitter and alone." I didn't rise to her words. I sat there quietly, watching her storm out of the room. Ryan followed behind her, silent and defeated. When the door slammed shut, I let out a long breath. My hands were steady. I felt lighter than I had in months. For the first time in a long time, I knew I was standing up for myself, and I wasn't backing down this time. The next few days after that dinner felt heavy. The house that was once filled with quiet routines now felt like it was holding its breath. Melissa barely spoke to me, and when she did, her words were sharp and cold. She slammed doors, left dirty dishes on purpose, and made small comments under her breath whenever I walked by. Ryan tried to keep the peace, but even he couldn't ignore how tense things had become. One evening, Ryan came into the kitchen while I was making tea. He looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from being stuck in the middle. "Mom," he said softly, "can we talk?" I nodded and kept stirring my cup. He took a deep breath. "Melissa's upset. She thinks this eviction thing is too much. Maybe you could give us more time. Just a couple of months until we figure things out." I turned to face him. "Ryan, I've given you both plenty of time. I didn't do this out of anger. I did it because I've been taken advantage of." He looked down at the floor. "She said you're overreacting. She said you're being harsh." I sighed. "Your wife used my credit card without permission. She called me names in my own home and made me feel like I didn't belong here. That's not a misunderstanding, Ryan. That's disrespect." He didn't know what to say. He rubbed the back of his neck and mumbled, "I'll talk to her again." Then he left the room. I felt sorry for him. He was trying to hold on to both sides, but one side had already broken the trust that held us together. The next morning, Melissa came storming into the living room with her phone in her hand. "Evelyn," she said sharply, "you can't just kick us out like that. You're old, and this isn't right. I could call Adult Protective Services and tell them you're being manipulated or confused. They take things like that seriously." I looked up from my chair, completely calm. I'd expected something like this. Without saying a word, I reached for the folder sitting on the coffee table and handed it to her. Inside were the printed receipts, page after page of charges made with my card, each one clearly showing her name and the shipping address to my house. Her face changed instantly. She went from angry to pale. Her hands trembled slightly as she flipped through the papers. "Where did you get these?" she asked in a small voice. "I didn't get them anywhere," I said. "They're mine. You made those purchases." "That's fraud, Melissa. If I wanted to, I could press charges." For once, she had nothing to say. She set the papers down and backed away slowly. Ryan came into the room just as she left, and when he looked at me, I could see in his eyes that he finally understood the truth. From that day on, Melissa avoided me completely. She stayed in their room, packed quietly, and didn't dare say another rude word. The silence in the house shifted. It was no longer tense. It was peaceful, like the calm after a storm. Ryan apologized again before going to bed that night, saying he hadn't realized how much had happened. I just told him gently, "It's okay, son. Some lessons are learned the hard way." As I sat alone that night with my tea, I finally felt like I had my home back. Melissa's threats no longer scared me. The truth was on my side, and that was all I needed. Move-out day came faster than I expected. The morning started quiet, but by noon, the tension filled every corner of the house. Boxes were stacked by the door, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, and I could hear Melissa muttering under her breath as she packed the last of their things. Ryan tried to stay calm, but Melissa's anger was growing with every passing minute. When the movers arrived, she completely lost control. She slammed cabinet doors, tossed drawers open, and threw things into boxes carelessly. "You've ruined everything," she shouted. "You broke this family apart. You're selfish, Evelyn. Who does this to their own son?" I stood near the doorway, my hands folded in front of me, trying to stay composed. "Family doesn't treat each other the way you treated me," I said quietly. My voice was steady, but my heart was beating fast. Melissa turned toward me, tears running down her face, anger mixing with guilt. "You think you're so perfect," she spat. "You'll die alone in this house one day, and no one will care." Ryan quickly stepped in, placing his hands on her shoulders. "Melissa, stop," he said firmly. "Please just stop." But she pulled away and continued to yell, blaming me for everything that had gone wrong in their lives. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I had already said everything that needed to be said. There was no point in trying to make her understand. Some people don't want understanding, they want control. And she had lost hers. After what felt like hours, they finally carried the last box out to the car. Melissa stood on the porch, still crying, still angry, while Ryan looked back at me one last time. His eyes were filled with sadness, maybe even regret, but he didn't say a word. He just gave a small nod and followed his wife down the steps. When the door closed behind them, I took a deep breath. The silence that followed was the kind I hadn't heard in months, soft, peaceful, comforting. For the first time in a long time, the house felt like mine again. No more shouting. No more tension. Just quiet. I walked through each room slowly, making sure everything was in order. The empty spaces where their things used to be didn't make me sad. They made me feel free. I went straight to the locksmith the next morning and had the locks changed. When I came back, I brewed a pot of tea, set it on the kitchen table, and fixed myself a full plate of lunch. As I sat down, I smiled to myself. I didn't feel lonely. I felt strong. The same house that once echoed with disrespect and chaos was now filled with peace. Every sip of tea, every bite of food, felt like a small victory. It wasn't just about kicking them out. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my space, and my life. And as the afternoon sun poured through the kitchen window, I finally felt something I hadn't in a long time. Peace that truly belonged to me. It had been 3 quiet months since Ryan and Melissa left. The house stayed peaceful, and every morning felt a little lighter. I spent my days tending to the garden, baking bread, and enjoying the calm that had once been missing from my life. The evenings were my favorite. I'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea, listening to the wind through the trees. I had no regrets about what I'd done. For the first time in a long time, I was living for myself. One Saturday morning, I heard a knock on the door. When I opened it, Ryan stood there, looking thinner and older than I remembered. His eyes were tired, and he clutched a small duffel bag in his hand. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said softly, "Mom, can we talk?" I stepped aside and nodded. We sat in the living room, the same place where so many tense conversations had once happened. But this time, the air felt different. Ryan took a deep breath before speaking. "Mom, I owe you an apology. You were right about everything. Melissa, she left me." He looked down at his hands. "After we moved out, she started spending all the money we had left. When I confronted her, she said she was done with me and took what was left of my savings. I didn't see it then, but she was only with me for what she could get." I reached out and placed my hand over his. "Ryan," I said gently, "sometimes life teaches us lessons through loss. What matters is that you've learned." Tears welled up in his eyes, and he nodded. "I'm so sorry for letting her treat you the way she did," he whispered. "I should have stood up for you. You didn't deserve any of that." I smiled faintly. "It's in the past now. We can't change what's done, but we can start fresh." He looked relieved, and for the first time in a long while, I saw the boy I'd raised, the one who used to help me bake cookies and laugh at my stories. We spent the afternoon talking, catching up, and remembering better days. It felt healing, like the house was welcoming him home again, but this time, with a different kind of understanding. After he left, I stood by the window for a long moment, watching him drive away. My heart felt lighter, not just because of his apology, but because I finally knew peace didn't come from having everything perfect. It came from standing up for myself when no one else would. That evening, I cooked a full Sunday dinner, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and cornbread, just the way I loved it. I set the table for one, poured myself a glass of sweet tea, and smiled as I filled my plate. For the first time, it wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about celebrating strength, survival, and self-respect. I finally had my peace, and this time, I served myself a full plate proudly.